Hello, my friend. Yes, you. Sit down for a second, close your grammar book, and just listen to me for the next few minutes, because what I am about to tell you might be the exact opposite of everything you have been taught about learning English. I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine a small child, maybe 2 years old, sitting on the floor, playing with toys. This child has never opened a grammar book. This child has never memorized a single rule about the present perfect tense or the difference between who and whom. This child cannot even read yet. And yet, in a few short years, this child will speak their native language fluently, naturally, without hesitation, without translating in their head, without freezing up when they need to answer a question. Now imagine you who have studied English for years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe even longer. You know grammar rules that most native speakers have never even heard of. You can explain the difference between the past simple and the present perfect better than many Americans or British people can. You have a vocabulary list longer than most novels, and yet, when someone asks you a simple question in English, something happens. Your mind goes blank. Your heart starts beating faster. You start translating from your native language, word by word, searching for the right grammar rule, checking your tenses, and by the time you finally open your mouth, the conversation has already moved on. Does this sound familiar to you? If it does, I want you to know something very important right now, in these first few seconds of this video. This is not your fault. You are not stupid. You are not bad at languages. You have simply been taught the wrong way to learn a language. And today, I am going to show you the right way. My name is Professor William Parker, and this is the Speaking Mindset. I have spent years studying how the human brain actually acquires language, not how textbooks think it should, but how it actually happens in real people, in real classrooms, in real conversations. And what I have discovered, what researchers in linguistics and neuroscience have discovered again and again, is that the traditional way most people learn English, the grammar first, rule-based, memorize and repeat method, is not just slow, it is actually working against your brain's natural ability to acquire language. Today, we are going to do something different. We are not going to study grammar today. We are going to talk about how your brain is actually wired to learn language, why listening comes before speaking, why translation is silently destroying your fluency, and I am going to give you a complete, practical roadmap that you can start using today, this very afternoon, to finally train your brain to speak English the way it was always meant to learn it, naturally. So get comfortable. Maybe you are listening to this while walking, while cooking, while driving, or while lying in bed. That is perfect, because that is exactly how this kind of learning is supposed to happen. Relaxed, natural, without pressure, without a pen and paper, without stress. Just listen. Let the words wash over you. Let your brain do what it already knows how to do. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Why grammar study is failing you. Let me ask you something honestly. How many grammar books have you finished in your life? How many grammar apps have you downloaded, used for 3 weeks with great enthusiasm, and then abandoned because you got bored or because you felt like you weren't improving fast enough? How many verb conjugation charts have you copied into a notebook, studied for hours, and then forgotten within a month? If you are like most English learners I have worked with over the years, the answer is many. Many books, many apps, many notebooks filled with rules you diligently memorized. And yet, despite all of this effort, all of this dedication, all of these hours spent staring at grammar tables, you still freeze up when someone speaks to you in real, natural English. You still feel that wave of panic when a native speaker asks you a simple, everyday question. This is not because you didn't study hard enough. In fact, I would argue that you studied too hard in the wrong direction. Let me explain what I mean. Grammar study teaches you about language. It gives you facts about English, rules about English, structures about English. It is like studying a map of a city instead of actually walking through the streets of that city. You can memorize every street name, every landmark, every direction on that map, and you will know a tremendous amount about the city. But the first time you actually step into that city and try to walk from the train station to a restaurant, you will feel lost, confused, and overwhelmed, because knowing about something is completely different from knowing how to use it in real time. This is exactly what happens when you focus only on grammar rules. Your brain stores this information in a part of memory that scientists call explicit or declarative memory. This is the same part of your brain where you store historical dates, mathematical formulas, and facts you learnt in school. It is conscious knowledge. You have to actively think about it, search for it, and apply it deliberately. But speaking a language fluently does not use this part of your brain. Fluent, natural speech comes from what scientists call implicit or procedural memory. This is the same part of your brain that lets you ride a bicycle without thinking about balance, or lets you catch a ball without calculating its trajectory, or lets you walk down stairs without consciously telling each leg what to do. This kind of memory is automatic. It doesn't require conscious thought, it just happens. Here is the problem. Grammar study builds explicit memory, but fluent speaking requires implicit memory, and there is a very limited bridge between these two systems. This is why so many advanced grammar students, people who can pass written English exams with flying colors, still struggle to hold a simple conversation. They have built a massive library of explicit knowledge about English, but they never built the automatic, implicit system that allows that knowledge to flow out naturally in real time. Think about the speed of natural conversation. When someone speaks to you in English, you don't have several seconds to think, okay, this is a question, so I need to invert the subject and the verb, and since they used the word yesterday, I need the past simple tense, not the present perfect. And the verb to go is irregular, so it becomes went. By the time your brain finishes this conscious grammatical analysis, the conversation has moved 3 sentences ahead, and you are still stuck, frozen, searching for the right words. Native speakers do not think about grammar rules when they speak. I want you to really sit with that idea for a moment. A native English speaker cannot explain to you why we say, I have been living here for 5 years, instead of, I am living here since 5 years, even though they say it correctly every single time without hesitation. They don't know the rule, they just feel what sounds right, because their brain absorbed thousands and thousands of hours of natural English before they ever needed to speak a single correct sentence. Their fluency was built through exposure, not through explanation. This is not to say grammar knowledge is completely useless. It has its place, especially for writing, for editing, for polishing an essay, or a professional email. But if your goal is to speak, to communicate naturally, to hold conversations without freezing, without translating, without that terrible pause before every sentence, then grammar study alone will never get you there. In fact, an over-reliance on grammar rules can actually slow you down in conversation, because your brain keeps stopping to check the rules instead of simply producing language automatically. I have seen this pattern over and over again with learners who come to me feeling frustrated and defeated. They tell me, Professor Parker, I don't understand. I know so much English. I got a very high score on my grammar exam. Why can't I speak? And when I ask them how they study, the answer is almost always the same. Grammar books, vocabulary lists, translation exercises, memorization, very little actual listening, very little exposure to real, natural spoken English, almost no speaking practice at all. This is like trying to become a swimmer by reading books about swimming technique, studying diagrams of arm movements, memorizing the physics of buoyancy, and never once getting into the water. You could become the world's leading expert on the theory of swimming and still drown the first time you jumped into a pool because your muscles never learned the actual movement. Your body never built the automatic implicit memory required to actually swim. Speaking English is the same. Your mouth, your tongue, your ears, your brain's language processing centers, all of these need real practice, real exposure, real repetition in context, not abstract rules studied in isolation. So here is what I want you to understand clearly, right now, at the beginning of this journey we are taking together. The reason you struggle to speak, despite years of study, is not because you are lacking intelligence or effort. it is because you have been building the wrong kind of knowledge. You have been filling your explicit memory with facts about English, when what you actually need is to build your implicit memory through natural exposure and practice. In the chapters ahead, I am going to show you exactly how to do this. We are going to talk about how children acquire language naturally and how you, as an adult, can tap into that same natural learning system. We are going to talk about the power of listening, the danger of translation, the magic of a technique called shadowing, and how to build a daily routine that trains your brain the way it was always designed to learn language. This is not going to be another lecture about grammar rules. This is going to be a complete shift in how you think about learning English. So stay with me, because in the next chapter, we are going to go deep into the science of how your brain actually acquires language. And once you understand this, you will never look at language learning the same way again. Chapter 2. How your brain actually learns language. Let's talk about the brain for a moment, because understanding this is going to change everything about how you approach English from this point forward. There is a famous linguist named Stephen Krashen who spent decades studying how people acquire second languages. His research led him to one of the most important discoveries in the history of language education. There is a fundamental difference between what he called language acquisition and language learning. Language learning is the conscious process of studying rules, memorizing vocabulary lists, and analyzing grammar structures. This is what happens in traditional classrooms. You learn about the language. Language acquisition, on the other hand, is the subconscious process of absorbing a language through meaningful exposure, the same way a child absorbs their native language. You don't study it, you simply experience it over and over in context until it becomes part of you. Krashen's research showed something remarkable. Acquisition, not learning, is what produces true fluency. The conscious knowledge you gain from learning grammar rules can help you edit your writing or notice mistakes when you have plenty of time to think, but it cannot produce the fast, automatic, natural speech that real conversation requires. Only acquisition can do that. So how does acquisition actually happen? Krashen proposed something called the input hypothesis, and I consider this one of the most important ideas you will ever learn about language. The theory states that we acquire language in only one way: by understanding messages, by receiving what he called comprehensible input. This means language that we can mostly understand, even if it is slightly above our current level. Think about that child we talked about earlier. That child is bathed in language constantly, all day, every day, for years, before they ever produce a complete sentence. Parents speak to them, simplify their language naturally, repeat words, point at objects, use tone and context to help meaning become clear. The child is receiving massive amounts of comprehensible input, and their brain, without any conscious effort, is quietly building the patterns, the rhythms, the structures of the language. Notice something important here. The child is not being tested on grammar. Nobody sits a 2-year-old down and says, "Today we will learn the irregular past tense." The child simply listens, absorbs, and eventually, when their brain has processed enough input, they begin to produce language naturally. First single words, then short phrases, then full sentences. This happens in a predictable order, in every language, in every culture, all over the world. This tells us something profound. Humans have a natural, biological capacity for language acquisition, and this capacity is triggered by exposure to comprehensible input, not by conscious study of rules. Now, here is the exciting part for you as an adult learner. This same system is still inside your brain right now. You did not lose this ability when you grew up. Adults absolutely can acquire language the same way children do, through massive amounts of comprehensible input. The system does not disappear. What often happens is that adults abandon this natural system in favor of the classroom method, the grammar-first method, because that is what school taught them was the correct way to learn. But your brain's natural acquisition device is still there, waiting to be used. Let's talk a little more about what happens physically inside your brain when you hear language you understand. When you listen to English that is at a comprehensible level, meaning you understand the overall meaning, even if you don't know every single word, your brain begins to unconsciously detect patterns. It notices that certain words tend to appear together. It notices the rhythm and melody of sentences, what linguists call prosody. It notices which word forms follow which other word forms. Over time, without you consciously trying to memorize anything, these patterns become embedded in your neural pathways. This is exactly how grammar becomes automatic and intuitive, the same way it is automatic and intuitive for native speakers, who, remember, cannot even explain most of the rules they follow perfectly. This process is sometimes called pattern recognition or statistical learning, and it is incredibly powerful. Your brain is quite literally a pattern recognition machine. Give it enough examples of a pattern in meaningful, understandable context, and it will extract the underlying rule automatically without you ever needing to see that rule written down in a textbook. This is why immersion works so well for people who move to English-speaking countries, even if they never study grammar formally. They are surrounded by comprehensible input all day: conversations at the grocery store, television shows, conversations with neighbors, signs on the street. Their brain is constantly receiving language in meaningful context, and over months and years, fluency emerges, often without the person ever opening a grammar book. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Professor Parker, I don't live in an English-speaking country. I can't immerse myself the way someone who moves abroad can. And this is a completely fair point. But here is the good news. In today's world, with the internet, with streaming platforms, with podcasts, with an endless supply of English content available at your fingertips, you can create a powerful immersion environment without ever leaving your home country. We are going to talk about exactly how to do this in the chapters ahead. But for now, I want you to internalize this core idea because it is the foundation for everything else we will discuss. Fluency comes from acquisition, not from learning. Acquisition comes from comprehensible input, meaning language you can understand in context. And this input-based process works the same way for you as an adult as it did for you when you were a small child acquiring your first language. This also explains why so many people who studied English for years in a classroom, focusing heavily on grammar rules and translation exercises, still cannot speak fluently, while some people who never formally studied English but spent years watching movies, listening to music, and talking with English speakers somehow developed impressive natural fluency. It is not magic, it is not talent, it is simply the difference between learning and acquiring. I also want to address something that might be worrying you right now. You might be thinking, but I already know so much grammar. Was all of that time wasted? No, not wasted, but perhaps misapplied. That grammar knowledge is still valuable, especially for careful writing, for understanding subtle nuances, and for self-correction when you have time to think. But going forward, we are going to shift the majority of your learning time toward acquisition-based methods, because this is what will actually unlock your ability to speak naturally and automatically. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about something called the silent period, a concept that will completely change the pressure you put on yourself to speak perfectly, right away, every single time. You are going to learn why listening first and speaking later is not a sign of weakness, but actually the exact process your brain is designed to follow. Stay with me. Chapter 3, The Silent Period, and Why Listening Comes First. I want to tell you about something that happens with every single child who acquires a language, in every culture, in every country, without exception. It's called the silent period, and understanding it is going to remove an enormous amount of pressure and anxiety from your English learning journey. Here is what I mean. When a baby is born into an English-speaking household, that baby does not start speaking English immediately. In fact, that baby says nothing at all, not a single recognizable word, for roughly the first 12 months of their life. And even after their first words appear, it often takes another year or more before they can form complete sentences. During this entire time, roughly 1 to 2 years, sometimes even longer, the child is listening, constantly, continuously, without producing very much language at all. Think about how much listening happens during that silent period. Thousands and thousands of hours of language exposure, all before the child produces their first meaningful sentence. The child is not lazy during this time. The child is not failing to learn. The child's brain is working extremely hard, quietly, invisibly, absorbing sounds, patterns, rhythms, meanings, building an enormous internal library of language before ever needing to produce it. This is such an important concept, and it is something that traditional classroom education completely ignores. In most English classes, you are expected to start speaking almost immediately from your very first lesson. You are asked to answer questions, repeat sentences, and perform in front of your classmates, often before your brain has had anywhere near enough exposure to actually produce natural language. This creates enormous anxiety, and it also forces you to rely on translation and conscious grammar construction instead of natural absorbed language patterns, because you simply haven't built up enough of a natural foundation yet. I want you to imagine trying to play a piece of music on the piano after only watching someone else play it one single time. You would struggle enormously, right? You wouldn't know where to place your fingers, you would hit wrong notes, you would feel embarrassed and frustrated. But if you had watched that same piece being played hundreds of times, listened to its rhythm, its pattern, its structure, over and over, your fingers would have a much better chance of naturally finding the right movements when you finally sat down to play. This is essentially what happens with language. The listening comes first, the output follows naturally once enough input has been absorbed. This does not mean you should never speak until you feel completely ready. That is not what I am suggesting at all, and we will talk about the importance of speaking practice in later chapters. What I am suggesting is that if you currently feel like you cannot speak fluently, if you feel frozen, blocked, unable to find words quickly, part of the reason may simply be that your brain has not yet received enough quality listening input to build the natural patterns needed for fluent output. And this is not a personal failure. This is simply how language acquisition works, biologically, for every human being on this planet. Many polyglots and language researchers actually recommend a period of focused listening before intensive speaking practice, especially at the beginning stages of learning a new skill within the language, whether that is a new topic, a new type of vocabulary, or simply building overall comfort with the language. This doesn't mean staying completely silent for a year. It means shifting the balance of your practice time significantly toward listening, especially if you feel that your speaking struggles come from a lack of internalized, natural language patterns rather than simply a lack of courage. Let's talk about why listening is so powerful for building speaking ability, even though it seems like a passive activity on the surface. When you listen to comprehensible English, spoken at a natural pace, in real conversations or well-produced content, your brain is doing an enormous amount of invisible work. It is training your ear to recognize the sounds of English, including sounds that might not exist in your native language. It is training your brain to recognize word boundaries in fast, connected speech, something that is incredibly difficult for learners because native speakers do not pause between each word the way textbook audio often does. It is absorbing natural sentence rhythms and stress patterns, which is crucial because English is a stress-timed language, meaning that certain words in a sentence are emphasized while others are compressed and spoken quickly. And this pattern is very difficult to learn through reading grammar rules alone. All of this listening work directly feeds into your speaking ability, even though you are not actively producing language during this time. Your brain is quietly building the neural pathways that will later allow words and phrases to come out naturally and automatically, without you having to consciously construct each sentence from grammar rules. I often tell my students this: if you feel like your speaking is weak, do not respond by forcing yourself to speak more and more under pressure while feeling anxious and frustrated. Instead, dramatically increase your listening input first. Feed your brain enormous amounts of comprehensible, natural English through conversations, through shows, through podcasts, through audiobooks. Give your brain the raw material it needs. Then, when you do practice speaking, you will find that words come more naturally because your brain has something to draw from, patterns it has already absorbed, rather than trying to build sentences entirely from scratch using conscious grammar rules under the pressure of a live conversation. There is also something beautifully freeing about embracing the silent period mentally, even if you do continue speaking regularly. It removes the harsh self-judgment so many learners carry. So many of my students tell me they feel embarrassed, ashamed even, that after years of studying they still struggle to speak fluently. I want you to release that shame right now. You are not behind, you are not failing. You may simply be in a stage where your brain needs more input before fluent output can emerge naturally. This is not weakness. This is exactly how language acquisition has worked for every human being throughout history. So here is a practical shift I want you to make starting today. Stop measuring your progress solely by how much you can say. Start also measuring your progress by how much comprehensible English you are exposing yourself to. Every hour you spend listening to English you can mostly understand is not wasted time. It is not really studying. It is, in fact, some of the most powerful language acquisition work you can possibly do. In the next chapter, we are going to go deeper into this idea of comprehensible input, because understanding exactly what makes input comprehensible and how to find or create it at your specific level is absolutely essential for this method to work. If your input is too difficult, you will feel lost and discouraged. If it is too easy, you won't make much progress. There is a sweet spot, and I am going to show you exactly how to find it. Chapter 4. Comprehensible Input, the real fuel for fluency. Let's go deeper now into the concept that Stephen Krashen called comprehensible input, because this single idea, more than almost anything else, will determine how quickly and how naturally you develop fluency in English. Comprehensible input means language input, whether spoken or written, that you can understand the overall meaning of, even if you don't understand every single word. Krashen described the ideal level of input using a simple formula, I plus 1. In this formula, I represents your current level of English ability, and the plus 1 represents material that is just slightly above your current level, challenging enough to push your understanding forward, but not so difficult that you become completely lost and overwhelmed. This is such an important balance to understand. If the English content you are consuming is far too difficult, if you understand only 10 or 20% of what is being said, your brain cannot extract useful patterns from it. It is simply noise. You will feel frustrated, discouraged, and you may even start to associate English with stress and failure, which is emotionally harmful to the learning process. On the other hand, if the content is far too easy, if you already understand everything perfectly with no challenge at all, you also will not make significant progress because there is nothing new for your brain to acquire. The magic happens in that middle zone, content you mostly understand, with enough new elements to gently stretch your ability forward. So how do you find this sweet spot in practice? Here is a simple guideline I give all of my students. Choose content where you understand somewhere between 70 and 90% of what is happening, based on the overall context, tone, and general meaning, even if you don't catch every individual word. If you are watching a video and you can follow the general story, understand the emotions, understand the main point being communicated, even though certain specific words or phrases go past you, this is likely a great level for you. If you find yourself completely lost, unable to follow even the basic gist of what is happening, that content might currently be too advanced, and it would serve you better to find something slightly simpler for now and gradually work your way up. I also want to address something important here. Comprehensible input does not always mean simplified. Artificial language created specifically for learners, although that certainly has its place, especially for beginners. As your level improves, comprehensible input increasingly means real, authentic English content, movies, YouTube videos, podcasts, interviews that you happen to understand well enough because of your growing vocabulary, your growing familiarity with natural speech patterns, and often, very importantly, because of context. Context is an enormously powerful tool. Even native speakers regularly hear words they don't fully know, but they understand the overall meaning because of the surrounding conversation, the visual scene, the tone of voice, the topic being discussed. You can use this same skill. You do not need to understand every single word to understand meaning, and training yourself to tolerate this uncertainty, this slight ambiguity, is actually a crucial skill for becoming a confident, natural English user. This brings me to something I consider one of the biggest obstacles for many learners: the desperate need to understand 100% of everything immediately, with no ambiguity at all. I understand where this comes from. In school, we are trained to seek perfect, complete understanding, to look up every unknown word, to translate every unclear sentence. But real natural language acquisition does not work this way, and clinging to this habit will dramatically slow down your progress and increase your frustration. Instead, I want you to practice what I call tolerating ambiguity. When you are listening to comprehensible input and you hear a word or phrase you don't recognize, resist the urge to immediately pause, look it up, write it down, and analyze it. Instead, let it go. Keep listening. Trust that the overall context will still make sense, and trust that if this word is important and common, you will hear it again and again in different contexts, and eventually your brain will naturally figure out its meaning without you ever needing a dictionary. This is exactly how children acquire vocabulary, through repeated, contextual exposure, not through memorized definition lists. Now, let's talk practically about where to find comprehensible input at your specific level, because this is where many learners get stuck. They know they should be listening more, but they don't know what to actually listen to. If you're at a beginner or lower intermediate level, look for content specifically designed for language learners, graded podcasts that use slower speech and simpler vocabulary, YouTube channels created specifically for English learners that explain things clearly and simply, children's shows and cartoons, which often use simpler, repetitive language and clear context through visuals, and audiobooks paired with the text, so you can follow along visually while listening. If you are at an intermediate level, you can start incorporating more authentic content, but choose wisely. Look for interviews or conversations where people speak reasonably clearly without excessive slang or extremely fast speech. Documentaries often work very well at this stage because the narration tends to be clear and there is a lot of visual context to support understanding. Podcasts on topics you are already personally interested in and knowledgeable about are excellent too, because your existing background knowledge fills in gaps even when you miss certain words. If you are at an advanced level, you can begin diving into fully authentic content: movies, television dramas, stand-up comedy, native podcasts meant for native speakers, and unscripted conversations. At this stage, your job is less about finding simplified content and more about finding content on topics you genuinely enjoy, because motivation and interest dramatically increase how much attention and retention your brain applies to what you're hearing. One more crucial point about comprehensible input: quantity matters enormously. Language acquisition through input is not something that happens after 1 hour of listening. It requires hundreds, eventually thousands, of hours of exposure over time. This might sound intimidating, but remember, this listening can happen while you are doing other things. It can happen during your commute, while cooking, while exercising, while doing household chores, while falling asleep. The beautiful thing about audio input especially is that it does not require your undivided visual attention the way reading a textbook does. You can weave massive amounts of English exposure into your daily life without ever needing to sit down and study in the traditional sense. I want you to start thinking of your English learning not as something you do for 30 minutes with a textbook each day, but as an environment you create around yourself throughout your entire day. Every podcast episode during your commute, every YouTube video during lunch, every English song you listen to while exercising, all of this is meaningful, powerful language acquisition happening in real time, even if it doesn't feel like traditional studying. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about a habit that is silently sabotaging so many English learners, a habit so common that most people don't even realize they are doing it, and it is directly working against everything we have discussed so far. I'm talking about translation and why breaking this habit is absolutely essential for developing true natural fluency. Chapter 5: Killing the Translation Habit. I want you to pay very close attention to this chapter because what I am about to describe might be the single biggest hidden obstacle standing between you and natural English fluency, and it is a habit so deeply ingrained in most learners that they don't even realize they are doing it anymore. I am talking about mental translation. This is the habit of hearing or wanting to say something in English and unconsciously running it through your native language first, translating the meaning back and forth in your mind before you speak or before you fully understand what you heard. Let me describe exactly what this looks like in practice, because I want you to recognize it in yourself if it is happening. Someone speaks to you in English. Before you can respond, your brain quietly, automatically translates their sentence into your native language so you can understand it. Then, when you want to reply, you first think of what you want to say in your native language, and then you begin the difficult, slow process of translating that thought into English, searching for the right words, checking the grammar, rearranging the sentence structure to match English patterns. By the time you finish this internal translation process, several seconds, sometimes many seconds, have passed, and the conversation feels awkward, slow, and exhausting, both for you and for the person you are speaking with. This translation habit is exhausting because it essentially requires you to do two full mental tasks simultaneously, thinking in your native language and translating in real time, while also trying to manage the social and emotional aspects of a conversation. No wonder you feel so tired after speaking English for even a short period. You are not just speaking a foreign language, you are performing constant, exhausting mental translation work behind the scenes. Native speakers do not do this. When a native English speaker thinks of something they want to say, the thought and the words arrive together, seamlessly in English. There is no translation step, because there is no other language competing for that mental space in that moment. Their thoughts and their language are directly connected. Here is the incredibly exciting news. This direct connection between thought and language, without translation, is absolutely achievable for you too. This is not some special gift that only certain lucky people have. This is a skill that develops naturally once your brain has absorbed enough direct English input and has stopped relying on your native language as a bridge or crutch. So how do we break this translation habit? Let me give you several powerful strategies. First, and this connects directly to what we discussed in the previous chapters, you need to dramatically reduce your reliance on bilingual dictionaries and translation apps during your learning process. I understand this feels scary at first, especially if you have relied on translation for years. But every single time you look up a word and see its direct translation into your native language, you are reinforcing that neural pathway, that habit of connecting English words to your native language rather than connecting English words directly to meaning, images, feelings, and context. Instead, whenever possible, use English to English resources. If you don't understand a word, try to figure out its meaning from context first. If you truly need a definition, look for simple English explanations rather than direct translations. Over time, this trains your brain to build direct connections between English words and concepts, bypassing your native language entirely. Second, practice what is sometimes called thinking in English. This does not mean you need to become a fluent thinker in English overnight. That will develop naturally over time through consistent practice. What it means practically is this. Throughout your day, try narrating simple things to yourself in English. When you make your morning coffee, silently describe what you are doing in simple English sentences in your head. I am pouring the water. I am adding sugar. This smells good. When you are walking somewhere, describe what you see around you in English, even using very simple vocabulary. This might feel strange and awkward at first, but this small daily practice builds direct, translation-free connections between your thoughts, your environment, and English language, exactly the same pathway that native speakers use automatically. Third, and this connects back to what we discussed about comprehensible input, when you are listening to English content, resist the urge to translate what you hear into your native language in your head as you listen. Instead, try to understand directly through context, tone, and visual cues if available. This is difficult at first, especially for beginners, and that is completely okay. It gets easier with practice. Every time you successfully understand something in English without mentally translating it, you are strengthening that direct connection, weakening the habitual translation pathway. Fourth, embrace what I call approximate understanding rather than perfect translation. When you hear an English sentence, you do not need to construct a perfect, word-for-word translation in your native language to understand the meaning. You simply need to grasp the overall idea. This is actually how comprehension works, even in your native language. When someone speaks to you in your mother tongue, you don't consciously analyze every grammatical structure of their sentence, you simply understand the meaning directly. Train yourself to accept this same kind of direct, approximate, meaning-based understanding in English, rather than demanding perfect, detailed translation. I know this transition away from translation can feel uncomfortable, even a little frightening, especially if you have relied on it as a safety net for a long time. But I want to reassure you, this discomfort is temporary and it is actually a sign of growth, not failure. Every learner who successfully develops natural fluency goes through this transition period where they gradually let go of translation and begin trusting direct English comprehension and expression instead. It does not happen overnight, but with consistent practice, especially combined with the heavy comprehensible input we discussed in the previous chapter, this transition happens more naturally and more quickly than you might expect. One more important point. When you do make mistakes, and you certainly will, especially during this transition, resist the urge to mentally calculate the correct grammatical rule in your native language framework and then translate it into English. Instead, notice the mistake gently, without harsh self-judgment, and simply continue engaging with more comprehensible input. Trust the process. Your brain is building these patterns continuously, even when you cannot consciously feel the progress happening. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about something incredibly practical: how to actually build your personal listening library, a curated collection of content specifically designed to maximize your language acquisition based on everything we have discussed so far about comprehensible input and natural learning. I am going to give you concrete, actionable steps you can implement starting today. Chapter 6: Building your personal listening library. Now that you understand the theory behind natural language acquisition, comprehensible input, the silent period, and the importance of breaking the translation habit, let's get very practical. In this chapter, I want to help you build what I call your personal listening library, a structured, intentional collection of English content that will fuel your language acquisition every single day. The biggest mistake I see learners make at this stage is randomly consuming English content without any real structure or intentionality. They watch one YouTube video, then switch to a completely different podcast about a completely different topic, then try an audiobook that is far too advanced, then give up after 20 minutes feeling overwhelmed. This scattered approach makes it very difficult to build the deep, repeated exposure that true acquisition requires. Instead, I want you to think about building your listening library in layers, much like building a house, starting with a strong foundation and gradually adding more complex structures on top. The first layer is your foundation content. This should be material that is comfortably within your comprehension range. Ideally material where you understand 80 to 90% without significant strain. This foundation content serves two purposes. It builds your confidence, and it allows your brain to absorb natural patterns without the exhausting mental effort of constantly struggling to understand. I recommend choosing 2 or 3 sources at this level that you genuinely enjoy, whether that's a specific podcast host whose voice you find pleasant and easy to follow, a YouTube channel covering topics you're personally interested in, or an audiobook in a genre you love. Return to these sources regularly because familiarity with a particular speaker's voice, accent, and speaking style actually accelerates your comprehension over time. The second layer is your stretch content. This is material slightly above your current comfortable level, where you understand perhaps 60 to 75%, challenging enough to push your growth, but not so difficult that you become completely lost. This is where real growth happens, in that stretch zone between comfortable and overwhelming. I recommend dedicating a smaller portion of your daily listening time to this stretch content, perhaps 20 to 30% of your total listening, while the majority remains in that comfortable foundation zone. The third layer, which becomes more relevant as your level increases, is authentic native content, consumed purely for enjoyment and cultural immersion, without worrying too much about catching every single detail. This might include movies, native podcasts, stand-up comedy, or unscripted interviews. At this stage, your goal shifts from careful, structured comprehension towards simply enjoying English as a living, breathing part of your entertainment and cultural life, which reinforces the idea that English is not just a subject to study, but a language to live in. Now let's talk about variety within your listening library, because this matters more than many learners realize. Your library should ideally include a mix of different formats. Include podcasts, which are excellent for building comprehension of natural conversational speech patterns, and which you can listen to passively during daily activities like commuting, cooking, or exercising. Include video content, particularly content with visual context that helps support your understanding, such as vlogs, interviews, or educational YouTube channels, because the combination of visual information and audio dramatically increases comprehension and retention. Include audiobooks, especially when paired with the written text, because following along visually while listening trains your brain to connect written and spoken English simultaneously, which is incredibly valuable. Include music, because song lyrics repeated over and over naturally embed phrases and vocabulary into your memory in a way that feels enjoyable rather than like studying. And include, when your level allows, unscripted content like talk shows, panel discussions, or casual conversations, because this exposes you to the natural hesitations, filler words, and conversational patterns of real spontaneous speech, which is quite different from the more polished language found in scripted content. I also want to emphasize the importance of topic interest. Choose content about subjects you already care about, whether that's cooking, business, sports, psychology, true crime, history, technology, or anything else that genuinely captures your attention. When you are personally interested in the topic, your brain naturally pays closer attention, retains more information, and experiences less mental fatigue during the listening process, even when the language itself is challenging. This is a powerful and often underused strategy. Many learners force themselves to listen to generic English learning content that bores them, when they could instead be building fluency through content about their genuine hobbies and passions, which dramatically increases both enjoyment and retention. Let's talk about a technique that can supercharge your listening library: repeated listening. Instead of listening to a piece of content only once and moving on, try listening to the same episode, video, or chapter multiple times, perhaps across several days. The first time, focus simply on understanding the general meaning. The second time, notice details you missed before. The third time, pay attention to specific phrases, expressions, or pronunciation patterns. This repeated exposure to the same natural language deeply reinforces those neural pathways we discussed earlier, and many learners report that specific phrases and structures from content they've listened to repeatedly begin appearing naturally in their own speech, without any conscious memorization effort at all. I also want to address a common concern. Professor Parker, should I take notes while I listen? Should I write down new vocabulary? My answer is, keep this light and optional. Don't let it become a burden that turns natural, enjoyable listening back into stressful, effortful studying. If a word or phrase naturally catches your attention because you've heard it several times and you're curious, feel free to jot it down briefly. But do not stop and pause constantly to write notes, look up words, or analyze grammar during your listening sessions. This breaks the natural flow of comprehension and turns what should be enjoyable, low-pressure input into exhausting, high-pressure study. Save any note-taking for a very brief period after your listening session, if you choose to do it at all. Now, let's talk about consistency and quantity, because this is truly where transformation happens. I recommend aiming for a minimum of 1 hour of comprehensible English input every single day, though more is certainly better if your schedule allows. This might sound like a lot, but remember, this listening can be woven throughout your existing daily activities. Your commute, your workout, your cooking time, your cleaning time, even the time you spend falling asleep. All of this can become valuable English listening time without requiring any additional hours carved out of your busy schedule. Over weeks and months of consistent listening, something remarkable begins to happen. Sentences that once felt confusing start to feel familiar. Words you've heard dozens of times in context suddenly click into clear understanding without you ever having memorized a formal definition. Grammar patterns that you struggled to apply consciously begin appearing naturally and correctly in your own speech, because your brain has absorbed the pattern through repeated exposure, exactly the same way a native speaker absorbed it as a child. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about a specific technique that bridges the gap between passive listening and active speaking. A powerful method used by many successful language learners and even professional interpreters called shadowing. This technique is going to become one of your most valuable tools for developing natural pronunciation, rhythm, and speaking fluency. Chapter 7: Shadowing, the Secret Speaking Accelerator. I want to introduce you now to one of the most powerful and unfortunately most underused techniques in language learning: shadowing. If comprehensible input is the foundation that builds your understanding, shadowing is the bridge that connects that understanding to actual, physical, natural speaking ability. Shadowing is a technique where you listen to a piece of audio, spoken English, and simultaneously, or with just a very slight delay, repeat what you hear out loud, trying to mimic not just the words, but the rhythm, the intonation, the pronunciation, and the natural flow of the speaker. This technique has been used for decades by professional interpreters as part of their training, and it has become increasingly popular among serious language learners because of how effectively it builds natural, automatic speaking ability. Let me explain why shadowing is so powerful, connecting it back to everything we've discussed so far. Remember, we talked about how fluent speech comes from implicit procedural memory, the same type of memory that lets you ride a bicycle without consciously thinking about balance. Shadowing directly trains this implicit memory system because it requires your mouth, your tongue, and your brain to physically produce English sounds and rhythms in real time, at natural speed, without the luxury of stopping to think about grammar rules or search for vocabulary. When you shadow a native speaker, you are essentially forcing your speech muscles, and yes, speaking really is a physical muscular activity involving very precise movements of your tongue, lips, and jaw to practice the actual physical movements required to produce natural English sounds and rhythms. This is fundamentally different from simply reading English silently or even reading English aloud at your own comfortable pace. Shadowing requires you to match the speed, the stress patterns, and the melody of natural native speech, which trains your speaking apparatus in a way that no other technique quite matches. Let me walk you through exactly how to practice shadowing effectively. First, choose your material carefully. For shadowing, you want content that is at or slightly below your comfortable comprehension level, because you need to be able to focus on pronunciation and rhythm without struggling to understand the meaning at the same time. Short clips work best when you're starting out, perhaps 30 seconds to 1 minute in length. Podcasts, YouTube videos with clear speech, or audiobook excerpts all work well for this purpose. Choose content with a transcript available if possible, especially when you're beginning, because having the text to reference helps enormously in the early stages. Second, begin with what I call the listen first phase. Before attempting to shadow a clip, listen to it several times simply to understand the meaning and become familiar with the general flow and rhythm of the speech. Do not attempt to shadow something you have never heard before, because you will simply be lost, struggling to catch up, and unable to focus on pronunciation. Third, once you're familiar with the content, begin shadowing, play the audio, and speak along with it, either simultaneously or with a very small delay of just a word or two behind the speaker. Do not worry if you stumble, mispronounce words, or fall behind in the beginning. This is completely normal and expected, especially when you're new to this technique. The goal is not perfection in your first attempt. The goal is consistent practice over time. Fourth, pay special attention to elements beyond just the individual words. Notice the rhythm of the sentence, which words are stressed and emphasized, and which words are spoken quickly and almost swallowed together, because English is a stress-timed language where certain words carry much more weight and duration than others. Notice the rising and falling melody of questions versus statements. Notice how words connect and blend together in natural speech, something linguists call connected speech, where the ending sound of one word often blends directly into the beginning sound of the next word, creating patterns that sound quite different from how individual words might be pronounced in isolation. Fifth, repeat the same short clip multiple times across your practice session, and even across multiple days if needed. Just like with your listening library, repetition here is incredibly valuable. Each time you shadow the same clip, you'll notice small improvements, catching sounds you missed before, matching the rhythm more closely, feeling more natural saying the phrases. I want to share something important about the psychological benefit of shadowing as well, beyond the pure linguistic training. Many learners tell me that shadowing helps them overcome their fear of speaking because it removes the pressure of having to generate original content or worry about making grammatical mistakes. You are simply repeating what you hear, which takes away that terrifying blank page feeling so many learners experience when asked to speak spontaneously. This lower pressure environment allows you to focus purely on the physical and auditory aspects of speaking, building comfort and confidence with the actual sounds and rhythms of English, which then transfers naturally into your spontaneous speech over time. I also want to mention a related technique that pairs beautifully with shadowing, recording yourself. Occasionally, record yourself shadowing a clip and then listen back, comparing your recording to the original. This might feel uncomfortable at first. Many people dislike hearing their own recorded voice, but this comparison is incredibly valuable for noticing specific areas where your pronunciation or rhythm differs from the natural speaker, giving you clear, concrete areas to focus your practice on. How often should you practice shadowing? I recommend incorporating short shadowing sessions, even just 10 to 15 minutes, into your daily routine, ideally alongside your broader listening practice. Consistency matters far more than duration here. A short, focused shadowing session every day will build your natural speaking ability far more effectively than an occasional longer session once a week. Over time, as you shadow more and more content, something wonderful begins to happen. Phrases, expressions, and natural sentence patterns that you've practiced repeatedly through shadowing begin appearing spontaneously in your own conversations without any conscious effort to recall or construct them. Your mouth has simply learned how to physically produce these patterns, and your brain has absorbed the natural rhythm and flow, so when you need similar language in a real conversation, it emerges automatically the exact same way native speakers produce their speech. In the next chapter, we are going to address something that affects nearly every single English learner I have ever worked with, something that often has nothing to do with language ability at all, and everything to do with psychology, the fear of speaking, and the crushing weight of perfectionism. Understanding and overcoming this emotional barrier is just as important as any technique we've discussed so far. Chapter 8: Overcoming Fear and Perfectionism. I have taught English learners for many years, and I can tell you with complete confidence that the biggest obstacle for most people is not vocabulary. It is not grammar. It is not even pronunciation. The biggest obstacle for the vast majority of struggling English speakers is fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of sounding stupid, fear of being judged, fear of embarrassing yourself in front of others. This fear is so powerful that it can completely paralyze even learners who possess substantial English knowledge, causing them to freeze, stammer, or avoid speaking situations entirely, even when they actually have the linguistic ability to communicate reasonably well. I want to talk honestly about where this fear comes from, and more importantly, how to dismantle it, because no amount of listening practice or shadowing will help you if fear is keeping you from ever opening your mouth in the first place. For many learners, this fear was actually planted and reinforced in traditional classroom settings. Think about your own experience learning English in school. Perhaps you remember a teacher correcting your pronunciation harshly in front of the entire class. Perhaps you remember classmates laughing, even gently, when you made a grammatical mistake. Perhaps you remember feeling your face turn red with embarrassment after being called on to answer a question you weren't prepared for. These experiences, repeated over years of formal education, teach us, on a deep emotional level, that speaking English is dangerous, that mistakes are shameful, and that perfection is the only acceptable standard. This creates what I call a perfectionism trap. You begin to believe that you should only speak once you can speak perfectly, without any grammatical errors, without any pronunciation mistakes, without any hesitation. But here is the painful truth about this belief. It guarantees that you will almost never speak at all, because perfect fluency, without any mistakes whatsoever, is not even how native speakers communicate. Native speakers make grammatical errors regularly. They use filler words, they pause, they restart sentences, they mispronounce words occasionally, and none of this prevents them from communicating effectively or being understood and respected. I want you to internalize something very important. Mistakes are not evidence of failure. Mistakes are evidence of learning in progress. Every single fluent English speaker in the world, including native speakers learning to read and write as children, and including every successful second language learner you might admire, went through a period, often a very long period, of making constant mistakes. This is not a sign that something is wrong with you. This is simply what the process of acquiring a language looks like for every human being, without exception. Let's talk about a concept called the affective filter, another important idea from Stephen Krashen's research that we touched on earlier in this series. Krashen proposed that emotional factors like anxiety, low motivation, and low self-confidence create a kind of mental filter that blocks language input from being processed and acquired effectively, even when that input is comprehensible. In simple terms, when you are anxious, stressed, and afraid, your brain becomes less capable of acquiring and producing language, regardless of how much knowledge you actually possess. This is why so many learners perform far worse in high-pressure speaking situations, like formal exams or important meetings, than they do in relaxed, low-pressure conversations with friends. The fear itself is actively interfering with your brain's ability to access the language you have worked so hard to acquire. This means that managing your emotional state, reducing anxiety, and building genuine confidence is not some optional fluffy self-help advice. It is a critical practical component of successful language acquisition. If you want to speak English fluently, you absolutely must address the fear that is currently blocking you, because that fear is quite literally interfering with your brain's language processing capabilities. So how do we begin dismantling this fear? Let me offer several practical strategies. First, deliberately lower the stakes of your speaking practice. Instead of forcing yourself into high-pressure situations, important business meetings, formal presentations, conversations with people whose opinion matters enormously to you, begin your speaking practice in low-stakes environments. Talk to yourself out loud when you're alone. Practice speaking with language exchange partners who are also learners and understand the struggle firsthand. Speak with patient, understanding native speakers who specifically enjoy helping learners rather than judgmental strangers. Gradually build your confidence in these safer spaces before moving toward higher pressure speaking situations. Second, reframe what a mistake actually means. Instead of viewing a grammatical error as a humiliating failure, try viewing it as valuable information, a small data point showing you exactly where your brain still needs a bit more input and practice. This is not shameful. This is simply useful feedback, the same way a scientist views an unexpected experimental result, not as a personal failure, but as valuable information that guides their next steps. Third, practice self-compassion actively and consciously. When you notice yourself making a mistake, or freezing up, or struggling to find words, resist the urge to harshly criticize yourself internally. Instead, speak to yourself the way you would speak to a good friend who was struggling with the exact same challenge. Would you tell your friend they were stupid, or hopeless, or embarrassing? Of course not. You would encourage them, remind them that this is a normal part of the learning process, and encourage them to keep trying. Extend that same compassion to yourself. Fourth, remember that native speakers are, in the vast majority of cases, incredibly forgiving and understanding of language learners. Most people you speak English with genuinely appreciate the effort you are making to communicate in a language that is not your native tongue, and they are far more focused on understanding your message than on judging small grammatical imperfections. The harsh judgment you fear from others is usually far greater in your own imagination than it is in reality. Most people are simply happy and often impressed that you are making the effort to communicate with them in English at all. Fifth, celebrate small wins consistently. Every single time you successfully communicate something, even imperfectly, even with hesitation, even with grammatical mistakes, that is a genuine success worth acknowledging. Did you order food successfully in English? That's a win. Did you understand a joke in a podcast without needing a translation? That's a win. Did you have a 5-minute conversation with someone, even if you stumbled a few times? That is absolutely a win. Training yourself to notice and celebrate these small victories gradually rebuilds your confidence and reduces the emotional weight you attach to imperfection. I want to leave you with one final thought in this chapter. Perfectionism is not actually about high standards. It is about fear disguised as high standards. True excellence in speaking English will come not from avoiding mistakes, but from making thousands of mistakes, learning from each one through continued exposure and practice, and gradually, naturally becoming more accurate and more fluent over time. This is the path every successful speaker has walked, and it is the path available to you as well, starting today, the moment you decide to release the crushing weight of needing to be perfect. In the next chapter, we are going to bring everything together into a concrete, actionable daily routine, so that all of these powerful concepts, comprehensible input, reduced translation, shadowing, and emotional confidence become a consistent, sustainable part of your everyday life. Chapter 9. Creating your daily immersion routine. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground together so far. We have talked about why grammar study alone fails to produce fluency, how your brain actually acquires language through comprehensible input, why the silent period matters, how to break the translation habit, how to build your personal listening library, the power of shadowing, and how to overcome the fear and perfectionism that silently blocks so many learners. Now, in this chapter, I want to bring all of these pieces together into a practical, sustainable daily routine that you can realistically follow, starting today. I want to emphasize something important before we dive into the specifics. Consistency matters far more than intensity. A learner who practices 30 focused minutes every single day will almost always outperform a learner who studies for 5 intense hours once a week and then does nothing for the rest of the week. Language acquisition is a gradual, cumulative process, and your brain needs regular, repeated exposure over time to build strong, lasting neural pathways. So as we design your daily routine, I want you to think realistically about what you can sustain consistently, rather than designing an ambitious plan that sounds impressive, but that you'll abandon after a few exhausting days. Let's build this routine together, step by step. Start your morning with a small dose of English, even before you fully wake up, if possible. This could be 5 to 10 minutes of listening to a podcast while you're still in bed, or while you're getting ready for your day, brushing your teeth, making breakfast. The goal here is simply to gently activate your English thinking brain early in the day, setting a tone of consistent exposure right from the start. During your commute, if you have one, or during any other transitional time in your day, such as walking, driving, or using public transportation, use this time for focused listening practice from your listening library. Remember what we discussed. This time can easily accumulate to 30 minutes, an hour, or more without requiring any additional time carved out of your schedule, simply by replacing time you might otherwise spend on your native language content with English content instead. During household activities, cooking, cleaning, exercising, use this time for additional listening practice, perhaps exploring your stretch content, the material slightly above your comfortable level, since your attention during these activities tends to be somewhat divided, making it a good time for content you already understand fairly well, allowing for passive reinforcement rather than intense, focused new learning. Dedicate a specific, focused block of time each day, even just 15 to 20 minutes, for active, undivided attention practice. This is where you would do your shadowing practice, working with a short audio clip, listening carefully, repeating the words out loud, focusing on rhythm and pronunciations. This kind of focused practice benefits enormously from your full attention without the distraction of other simultaneous activities. So try to find a quiet moment in your day, perhaps right after a meal or during a scheduled break, where you can give this practice your complete focus. Throughout your day, practice the thinking in English technique we discussed earlier, narrating simple actions and observations to yourself in English, even for just a few minutes here and there. This doesn't require any dedicated time slot. It can happen while you're waiting in line, while you're taking a short break at work, while you're walking from one place to another. If possible, incorporate some form of actual speaking practice several times per week, even if not every single day. This might be a conversation with a language exchange partner, a video call with a patient native speaker friend, or even simply speaking out loud to yourself, describing your day, your thoughts, or your plans, practicing forming complete sentences and expressing yourself without the safety net of writing things down first. Before bed, consider ending your day the same way you might have started it, with a small dose of relaxing English content, perhaps an audiobook chapter, a calm podcast episode, or even English music. Many learners find that content consumed right before sleep is processed particularly well by the brain during the consolidation that happens during sleep, helping to reinforce the patterns absorbed throughout the day. Now, I want to address something important. This routine does not need to happen perfectly every single day. Life happens. Some days will be busier than others. Some days you'll have more energy and focus than others. The goal is not rigid perfection, but rather consistent, sustainable engagement over time. If you miss a day, or even several days, simply return to the routine without harsh self-judgment and continue moving forward. Remember what we discussed in the previous chapter about self-compassion. This applies to your overall learning journey as much as it applies to individual speaking mistakes. I also want to encourage you to track your progress in a way that feels motivating rather than stressful. This doesn't need to be a formal, detailed log if that feels overwhelming. It could simply be a mental note or a simple journal entry once a week, reflecting on what you noticed, perhaps a phrase you understood without translating, a conversation that felt slightly easier than it used to, a piece of content you could follow more comfortably than before. These small signs of progress are incredibly valuable for maintaining motivation over the weeks and months it takes for substantial fluency to develop. Let's also talk about adjusting your routine as your level improves. In the beginning stages, your routine might lean heavily toward comfortable, foundational listening content with shorter, gentler shadowing sessions. As your comprehension and confidence grow, gradually shift more of your time towards stretch content and authentic native material. Increase the length and complexity of your shadowing sessions and increase the frequency and duration of actual speaking practice. This routine should evolve with you, always staying slightly ahead of your current comfort zone, without ever becoming so overwhelming that it triggers the anxiety and frustration we discussed in the previous chapter. One final practical tip: try to make this routine as enjoyable and frictionless as possible. Choose content you genuinely look forward to consuming. Set up your listening queue in advance so you're not wasting time each day searching for what to listen to. Keep your shadowing clips easily accessible and organized. The more enjoyable and effortless you make this daily practice, the more likely you are to sustain it consistently over the months required for real transformation to occur. In our final chapter together, I want to talk about something that ties everything together: the long-term mindset required for this journey, the patience, the identity shift, and the deep trust in the process that will carry you through the inevitable plateaus and challenges you'll encounter along the way to true natural English fluency. Chapter 10: The Long Game, Patience, Identity, and Trusting the Process. We have arrived at our final chapter together, and I want to spend this time talking about something that, more than any specific technique or strategy, will ultimately determine whether you succeed in developing natural, confident English fluency: your mindset over the long term. Language acquisition is not a quick process. I want to be honest with you about this, because I believe honesty serves you far better than empty promises of overnight transformation. Building true, natural fluency, the kind where you no longer translate, where words come to you automatically, where you can hold conversations without that exhausting mental strain, this takes sustained effort over months and, realistically, years. This is not because you are slow or because something is wrong with your approach. This is simply the nature of how deep, automatic, implicit learning works for any complex skill, whether that skill is language, music, or sport. I share this not to discourage you, but to protect you from the discouragement that comes from unrealistic expectations. So many learners give up not because the method isn't working, but because they expected faster results, and when those results didn't materialize within a few weeks, they concluded incorrectly that something was wrong, that they were failing, that they should try yet another method, and yet another, jumping from approach to approach without ever giving any single method the sustained time it actually needs to produce real results. I want you to commit right now to giving this natural acquisition approach genuine time. Not a few days, not a couple of weeks. I'm talking about months of consistent practice, ideally paired with the daily routine we discussed in the previous chapter. This is how real change happens in language acquisition, gradually, cumulatively, often invisibly, until one day you suddenly notice that a conversation felt easier than it used to, that you understood an entire podcast episode without straining, that a sentence came out of your mouth in English without any conscious translation at all. Let's talk about plateaus, because you will almost certainly experience them along this journey. A plateau is a period where it feels like you're not making any progress at all, despite continuing your consistent practice. This can feel deeply frustrating, especially after an earlier period where progress felt more visible and exciting. I want you to understand that plateaus are a completely normal, expected part of skill acquisition, in language learning, and in virtually every other complex skill humans develop. Your brain is still working, still processing, still building deeper neural connections during these plateau periods, even when the progress isn't immediately visible to you. Many learners describe sudden breakthroughs that occur right after a frustrating plateau period, almost as if all that quiet, invisible work suddenly crystallizes into a noticeable jump in ability. Trust this process, even when it feels slow, even when it feels like nothing is happening. I also want to talk about something deeper than technique and strategy: identity. So much of language learning struggle comes from an internal identity conflict. Part of you still identifies as someone who doesn't speak English well, a story you've told yourself, perhaps for years, based on past struggles and frustrations. This identity, even though it might have been accurate in the past, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, subtly sabotaging your progress because your subconscious mind works to keep your behavior consistent with your self-image. I want to invite you to begin consciously shifting this identity starting today. Instead of thinking of yourself as someone struggling to learn English, begin thinking of yourself as someone who is actively becoming a natural, confident English speaker. This might sound like a small shift, but identity shifts like this have a profound effect on behavior and persistence over time. When you see yourself as someone in the process of becoming fluent, rather than someone perpetually stuck and struggling, you naturally begin making choices that align with that identity. Choosing to listen to that podcast even when you're tired, choosing to attempt that conversation even when you feel nervous, because that is simply what a person becoming fluent does. I also want to remind you of something we discussed earlier in this series, but which bears repeating here at the end. The process you are engaging in, comprehensible input, reduced reliance on translation, shadowing practice, and consistent daily exposure, is not some experimental or unproven method. This is, quite literally, the same fundamental process every single fluent speaker of every language on earth has used to acquire their native tongue. You are not doing something unusual or risky. You are tapping into humanity's oldest, most proven, most universal system for language acquisition. Trust it, because it has worked for every single human being who has ever successfully acquired a language throughout all of human history. I want to leave you with a few final thoughts as we close this video together. First, remember that comparison is often the enemy of progress. Try to avoid comparing your English journey to other learners you see online, people who might present a polished, curated version of rapid success. Everyone's journey looks different, depends on different starting points, different available time, different life circumstances. Focus on your own consistent progress, measured against where you were previously, rather than against someone else's highlight reel. Second, remember that enjoyment matters enormously for sustainability. If your English learning routine feels like pure obligation, pure grinding effort, it will be very difficult to sustain over the months and years required for deep fluency. Wherever possible, weave genuine enjoyment into your practice, content you love, topics you're curious about, conversations with people you actually enjoy talking to. Sustainable enjoyment will carry you further than short bursts of disciplined suffering. Third, and perhaps most importantly, be patient and kind with yourself throughout this entire journey. You are engaging in one of the most complex cognitive tasks a human brain can undertake, acquiring an entirely new language as an adult. This deserves patience, deserves compassion, and deserves genuine celebration of every small step forward, rather than harsh judgment for not yet being where you eventually want to be. You have everything you need within you right now to become a natural, confident English speaker. Your brain already possesses the incredible ancient system required for language acquisition, the same system that allowed you to acquire your native language as a child. All that remains is to feed that system consistently with comprehensible input, with reduced translation, with shadowing practice, with patience, and with self-compassion, and trust that, exactly as it has for every human being throughout history, that system will do its remarkable work. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this video helped shift your thinking about how English acquisition truly works, I encourage you to begin implementing even just one small piece of what we discussed today. Choosing your first comprehensible input source, trying your first shadowing session, or simply committing to listening for one focused hour today. Small, consistent steps, taken daily, will carry you further than you might currently believe possible. This has been The Speaking Mindset, and I am Professor William Parker. Keep listening, keep practicing, be patient with yourself, and trust the process. Your natural, confident English voice is already inside you, waiting to emerge. I will see you in the next video.